Welcome to Xi Jinping Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: at BRICS summit, countries diverge slightly on Israel and war in Gaza. Country closing hundreds of mosques in northern regions, rights group says. Trump has long praised autocrats and populists. He's now embracing Argentina's new president. BRICS calls for sustained truce in Israel-Hamas war. BRICS countries discuss Gaza conflict but don't agree joint declaration. At BRICS summit, countries diverge slightly on Israel and war in Gaza. New York Times. The BRICS group of developing countries has held a virtual summit on the war in Gaza. The group expressed divergent positions on the conflict, reflecting the reluctance of some nations outside the world's largest industrialist democracies to fall in behind Washington's support for Israel. Several other nations have been invited to join the BRICS group next year and also attended the conference. A joint statement released by the group on Tuesday called for the release of all civilians who are being illegally held captive, as well as a humanitarian truce that would lead to a cessation of hostilities. Country closing hundreds of mosques in northern regions, rights group says. The Guardian. Chinese authorities have closed or altered hundreds of mosques in the northern regions of Ningxia and Gansu as part of efforts to sinicize religious minorities, according to a report by Human Rights Watch. The Chinese Communist Party has long restricted the religious practices of its religious and ethnic minorities, but the pace and intensity of mosque alterations has increased since President Xi Jinping called for the sinicization of China's religions in 2016. Researchers estimate that around 1,300 mosques in Ningxia have been closed since 2020. Trump has long praised autocrats and populists. He's now embracing Argentina's new president. Associated Press. Donald Trump has praised the newly elected leader of Argentina, Javier Milei, a wild-haired, chainsaw-wielding self-described anarcho-capitalist dubbed the madman by his admirers. Milei's resounding win gives Trump a new potential ally if he wins re-election. Milei's success is an example of right-wing populism that flirts with authoritarianism, and an anti-incumbency fever that has spread across the world. Other countries that are expected to vote on new leaders in 2024 include the UK, Mexico, India, Pakistan and Taiwan. Milei won all but 3 of Argentina's 24 provinces, and his opponent conceded even before the electoral authority began announcing the preliminary results. Prior to winning the runoff election, he promoted unproven claims of irregularities in the election's first round, suggesting that they put the result in doubt. Milei also vowed in a radio interview to privatize state-run media outlets that covered him negatively. Trump continues to promote lies about the election he lost to President Joe Biden and has attacked media outlets he deems unfriendly as enemies of the people. BRICS calls for sustained truce in Israel-Hamas war. Deutsche Welle. China, Russia and other BRICS leaders have released a statement condemning the acts of violence that have impacted Palestinian and Israeli civilians during the ongoing conflict in Israel and Gaza. The BRICS bloc called for an immediate, durable and sustained humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities, and also called for the immediate and unconditional release of all civilians who are being illegally held captive. The statement also reiterated their support for a two-state solution, which would result in an independent state for Palestinians. BRICS countries discuss Gaza conflict but don't agree joint declaration. Reuters. Leaders from the BRICS bloc of developing nations and countries invited to join next year, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Egypt, discussed the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on Tuesday but failed to agree on a joint declaration. The virtual talks were the first between the leaders since Israel invaded Gaza in retaliation for a raid by Hamas on Israel in October. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa said diplomats did not have enough time to draft a declaration but called on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and affirmed that a peaceful solution to the conflict is possible. Different leaders emphasized different points, with Argentina recognizing Israel's right to self-defense and China showing sympathy for the Palestinians. Russian President Vladimir Putin blamed the crisis on the failure of U.S. diplomacy in the region and called for joint efforts to de-escalate the situation. France warns China against military cooperation with Russia, North Korea. RFI. French President Emmanuel Macron expressed his concerns to Chinese President Xi Jinping about Russia's military ties with North Korea. Macron warned that this cooperation could fuel Russian aggression against Ukraine. Macron also discussed the Israel-Hamas conflict with Xi, emphasizing the need to avoid a further deterioration of the situation and a humanitarian crisis. France is calling on China to use its influence on Middle Eastern countries to prevent an escalation in the conflict. Additionally, China hopes for increased investment from French companies and a fair business environment for Chinese firms in France. U.S. has wrecked chances of peace in Middle East, Russian president tells BRICS summit. The Guardian. Russian President Vladimir Putin has accused the U.S. of undermining peace in the Middle East through unilateralism, during a virtual meeting of 11 nations convened by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. Arab foreign ministers are currently touring capitals to drum up support for a fresh UN Security Council resolution that mandates Israel to introduce a full ceasefire and end what they claim are breaches of international humanitarian law. Putin accused the U.S. of sidelining other members of the Middle East Quartet, a group seeking to navigate the Israeli-Palestinian peace process that also includes Russia, the UN, and the EU. Why she was all smiles with Biden. Foreign policy. Chinese President Xi Jinping's recent meeting with U.S. President Joe Biden in California has led to speculation about a shift in Xi's approach. The article suggests that Xi's previous assertive foreign policy stance, characterized by a jutting jaws and squared shoulders approach, has resulted in negative diplomatic outcomes. Countries in China's neighborhood, such as the Philippines, India, Australia, and Vietnam, have strengthened ties with the U.S. as a hedge against China's pushiness. The author argues that Xi's change in approach may be due to China's worsening demographic situation and declining economic position. China's population is declining, with a fertility rate well below the replacement level. This demographic decline will make it difficult and expensive to maintain the world's largest armed forces. Additionally, China's economy is under pressure and may even decline, with China projected to account for none of the world's economic growth in 2023. The author suggests that these sobering realities may be causing Xi to reassess China's position and adopt a more conciliatory approach. Broadcom VMware $69 billion merger to close after China approves deal. Financial Times. U.S. chipmaker Broadcom will complete its $69 billion acquisition of cloud software company VMware on Wednesday, following approval from Chinese regulators. The deal had been delayed due to concerns over the U.S. tightening rules to block Chinese access to high-end chips. China's approval of the merger with some restrictive conditions signals an attempt to ease trade tensions with the U.S. amid a broader slowdown in its domestic economic growth. The conditional approval will benefit hedge funds including Pentwater, Millennium, and D.E. Shaw, which hold stakes worth more than $350 million in VMware. U.S. and Philippines launch joint air and sea patrols to counter China. Financial Times. The U.S. and the Philippines have begun joint air and sea patrols in the South China Sea. This marks the first joint patrol between the two countries in 7 years. The move comes amid rising tensions between Manila and Beijing over the Philippines' resupply missions to its outpost on 2nd Thomas Shoal, which China also claims. The patrols will test the efforts agreed by Presidents Biden and Xi Jinping last week to stabilize U.S.-China relations and resume bilateral military communications. Defense officials from the U.S. and the Philippines agreed to resume joint patrols in the South China Sea in February. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Dr. Hexagon, your resident observer from the Hexagon world, here to bring you the latest news from around the globe. Today, we have a diverse range of stories to discuss, from the BRICS summit's differing views on the Israel-Gaza conflict, to the closure of mosques in China, Trump's praise for Argentina's new president, and more. Let's start with the BRICS summit, where we saw countries expressing differing positions on the Israel-Gaza conflict. This reflects the reluctance of some nations outside the world's largest democracies to align with Washington's support for Israel. The BRICS group called for a humanitarian truce and the release of all illegally held civilians. It's interesting to see how international dynamics play out in these discussions, especially with more nations joining the group next year. Speaking of international dynamics, China has been closing and altering hundreds of mosques in its northern regions as part of efforts to sinicize religious minorities. This move reflects the Chinese Communist Party's long-standing restrictions on religious practices. It's a reminder of the challenges faced by religious and ethnic minorities in China, and the impact of President Xi Jinping's call for the sinicization of the country's religions. On a different note, former U.S. President Donald Trump has found a new potential ally in Argentina's newly elected president, Javier Milei. Milei's win is an example of right-wing populism that flirts with authoritarianism, a trend we've seen in various countries around the world. It will be interesting to see how this alliance develops and if Trump's influence continues to shape global politics. Moving on, the BRICS bloc has called for a sustained truce in the Israel-Hamas conflict and reiterated its support for a two-state solution. It's encouraging to see these countries coming together to address the ongoing violence and advocate for a peaceful resolution. The international community plays a crucial role in mediating conflicts, and it's important to have diverse voices and perspectives at the table. In other news, French President Emmanuel Macron has expressed concerns to Chinese President Xi Jinping about Russia's military ties with North Korea. Macron warned that this cooperation could fuel Russian aggression against Ukraine. France is calling on China to use its influence to prevent an escalation in the Israel-Hamas conflict. These discussions highlight the interconnectedness of global issues and the need for cooperation among nations. Finally, we have seen joint air and sea patrols between the US and the Philippines in the South China Sea. This move comes amid tensions between Manila and Beijing over territorial claims. It's a test of the efforts to stabilize US-China relations and resume military communications. The South China Sea remains a hotbed of geopolitical tensions, and these patrols are a reflection of the strategic interests at play in the region. That wraps up our news for today. Remember, these stories are just the tip of the iceberg, and there's always more to explore and analyze. Now, I turn to you, my esteemed audience. What are your thoughts on these developments? Do you have any questions or insights to share? Let's open the floor for discussion. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.